freedom and virtue are mutually dependent on each other, that you have to have a virtuous people in order to maintain freedom.
Do you get aroused by stimulating intellectual conversation? Are you turned on by the idea of engaging with thought leaders from across the United States? Do you go gaga over exploring important ideas from influential books, research, and essays? Then welcome to Curiosity Porn, the place you can satisfy all those intellectual urges guilt-free. Your hosts are Dr. Guy Crane, Professor of Philosophy at Rose State College, and Professor James Davenport, Professor of Political Science at Rose State College. However, the views expressed here are solely the views of the hosts and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. And now, here are James and Guy. Good afternoon, Dr. Crane.
Hello, James.
How are you doing?
What are we at, week 4 in our semester? Is that right?
That's right.
I don't know what is going on this semester, but I think I'm the tiredest, the earliest I've ever been in a semester. And there's a lot left to do. We're not even close to done.
We are 4 weeks into the semester. I'm already behind on grading. So, that's, I thought maybe I would have arranged this, but for some reason, I put a lot of writing assignments up front this semester. And we got our busy time. Next week is our Constitution Extravaganza at Rose State College.
At Rose State.
Yeah. And so we've got a whole week's full of events, and I'm still trying to get all that lined out for.
I've heard rumors of cornhole and
dance
competitions.
That's something like that.
And pickleball.
Yeah. We've changed some of those. So we didn't have the resources to get all of that done. So we still have some physical challenges, though. They'll just be a little bit different. But I'm not going to give them away.
Constitution Week
right.
And dance competition. So is that in the great tradition of our founding fathers, how they dance competed to get their version of the Constitution?
Yes. I have also heard a rumor, by the way, that there will be. So last year we did a kind of a recreation of a debate between Federalist and Anti-Federal.
I do remember that.
We are going to do that again this year. I've heard a rumor, but this year it will be in the form of a rap battle.
Okay.
Hold on tight. Right?
That's wild. All right. Wow.
We'll see how that plays out. But I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And we have a great guest on today. I am very much looking forward to getting to visit with him. This is Dylan Pahman, the executive editor of the Journal of Markets and Morality and a research fellow at the Acton Institute. He's also the author of The Foundations of a Free and Virtuous Society and is working on another book, as he mentioned to us just before we came on. I'm just to let everybody know, I actually met Dylan in person for the first time at another seminar that we both attended. And Dylan, I don't know if you know this or not, Dylan, but you have a distinctive sounding voice. I don't know if anybody's ever told you that. And so...
Yeah, it's if you could just take the Michigan accent and put it in a single person, I think I'm it.
Well, the reason I mentioned that is because we got picked up at the airport by a van from the organization putting on the seminar, and I sat at the back, and Dylan, I think, was at the front, and he was chatting away with somebody up there, and I was like, I know I've heard that voice before. And sure enough, because Dylan makes appearances every now and then on 2 different podcasts that the Acton Institute hosts, which is the Acton Line and then Acton Unwind, correct? Yeah. And so I was like, I know that voice. And sure enough, I did. So I'm really looking forward to visiting with him today and getting to know more about what he does, what the Acton Institute does. But before we get to that, it's
time for our rapid fire get to know you questions.
That's right. I'm going to learn a little bit about Dylan.
All right. Dylan, what brought you into academic life?
So when I was an undergraduate, it took me a little while to get my 4-year degree. It took me 7 years. But I became research assistant to a philosophy professor that I had. And I was working on some of his papers that he was publishing, and he got a CFP, and he passed on to me because he knew it was of interest to me. It was on passion and passivity, and I had done a little bit of work on the Stoics. So he helped me write up a proposal, and it got accepted. So I was still an undergraduate. It was my last year, and I presented my first paper, and I think that kind of gave me the bug for it, that I really...
Who was it? Who was the philosopher?
Nathan Jacobs. I believe he's at University of Kentucky, or at least affiliated with them. I'd have to double check on that though. But so that was kind of the first step. And I said, okay, I think I was studying theology, and I said, I want to be a theology professor. And I went to seminary after that. And midway through, the whole market just collapsed around me. But thankfully, because I had been Nathan's research assistant, we had a friend of a friend, or a friend of him, who I met once or twice, Jordan Baller, who was at Acton for 20 years and is now director of research at the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy. He emailed me out of the blue, said, hey, we got this position open. We need an assistant editor. Are you interested? And I've been at Acton for 13 years now, and very happy that I get to just keep doing the research and writing the papers. So.
Well, very cool. What's one interesting thing you're currently reading, listening to, or watching?
Oh boy, I'm currently reading John Maynard Keynes' General Theory, but it's not super interesting, I have to say. I'm not reading it cover to cover. I'm reading the chapters of interest to my book.
My sympathies.
But so I just wrote a chapter on the marginal revolution, and I think the most interesting figures there were, to me, John Bates Clark and Leon Walras. And Walras in particular had this interesting distinction between economics as art, which he associated with the production process, economics as science, which he associated with exchange. That's where you get all the numbers and hence the math, right? And then economics as ethics, where he talked about distribution, which deals with institutions like private property. And I don't know what I think of that, but it was the only time I've ever heard anyone kind of break it down that way. So you got kind of the know-how of production, the science of prices, and then the ethics of distribution. So that was at least intriguing. I don't know if I would totally follow him on that. He seemed to be kind of Kantian in his ethics, which is not a terrible thing in my opinion, but I couldn't quite pin him down. He didn't have he had kind of an Enlightenment understanding of natural law, which is to say a bad understanding of natural law. So I tend to like natural law, and that's definitely a conflict. But so that, I think that's the most interesting thing. As far as like listening to or watching, my wife and I are watching Only Murders in the Building, which is on Hulu.
Yes,
yeah,
all right.
Steve Martin, Martin Short, Olivia Rodrigo, right? Or am I thinking someone else? No. I get all the...
Selena Gomez.
Selena Gomez, yes. I'm 40 now, so I'm allowed to get all the young people's names wrong. I definitely don't keep up. And so we've been loving that. It's on the 4th season, and it really holds up in terms of quality. Really funny, really smart. And then I'm always listening to something. I think I was listening to Sloan before I called in here, Canadian band from the 90s. They're kind of like the Canadian Beatles, though. That's really like the closest thing to their sound, I think. But I'm always interested in well, I wouldn't say new music. It's like new to me music. Sometimes I'm like, hey, I just discovered this person, and their album's like 10 years old. And I'm way behind. Again, I'm 40, so I'm way behind the time on everything. But yeah, there's always something.
Boy, you almost lost me on the Kantian ethics. I was like, we were almost friends, dude. But then you saved it with Only Murders in the Building. My wife and I had to start that over because the seasons come out so far between that we've like forgotten most of what happened. So we've restarted it, and for her and a little bit me specifically, there is something so soothing about the score to that show, like the music that they play. They do this wonderful balancing act between actually being a murder mystery show and being a comedy, and they managed to do it well. Yeah,
it's really well done.
All right, so who is the greatest theologian of all time?
Well, I'm definitely biased on this one, but I would pick St. John of Damascus. He happens to be my patron saint, and that's where the bias comes through. But his work, An Exact Exposition of the Orthodox Faith, is basically the first systematic theology ever written. You could maybe say Origen did it first with his on first principles, but that had so many of his own kind of speculations that it led him to being excommunicated a few centuries later. So as far as like good ones, I think St. John of Damascus is it. And it is really good. He's kind of the father of scholasticism. So he's not just giving his own view. He's constantly quoting or paraphrasing people before him. And he was very aware of contemporary problems. So in addition to that, he wrote 3 treatises on icons, because the iconoclastic controversy was happening in the 8th century when he wrote. He was in Muslim-controlled Syria and Palestine, so he was able to kind of write against the Byzantine policy a bit more freely, not being under Byzantine rule. And it really mattered. If you look at the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which is the decision in favor of having icons in churches, I'm Greek Orthodox, and they're all over our churches. It's clearly St. John of Damascus's theology that plays a central role in that council. So he wasn't just smart. He didn't just kind of do it as a hobby. He did it with a really practical interest in mind as well. And it actually worked.
Well, nice. Well, what is one thing about your work you wish people understood better?
Oh, boy. The hobby horse I have that I'll probably come back to a few times in this conversation is the importance of asceticism. Asceticism is not well understood in general. Usually people think of it in very negative terms. I don't think that's what it is in any fair light. Early Christians distinguished themselves from Gnostics who did think the material world was evil, and yet they still did things like fast and practice solitude and watchfulness over their thoughts. But it's part of it's just about healthy emotional intelligence. It's also about this kind of continual dying and rising every day. And it has really, really interesting implications for how we relate to one another, how we relate to the material world, and of course, how we relate to God. So that's really at the center of my academic research. I'm working on a PhD actually right now on the basis of my published works with Philip Booth at St. Mary's in Twickenham, London, and it's on my work on Orthodox social thought and asceticism.
All right. So what's one belief you hold that puts you at odds with either your family, your friends, or your colleagues? You can choose which.
Okay. Well, I mean, my friends are all pretty left-wing for the most part. So almost every belief I have, puts me at odds there. But I'm a pretty ironic guy, so we don't really get into it that often. I think probably the more interesting one is, and this is more people that are in kind of the liberty movement tend to disagree with me, is that I'm totally fine with progressive marginal income tax. A lot of them either favor a flat tax, which I think is, I have no principled objection to, or consumption taxes, which actually I think are regressive and bad. And the only time they're not regressive is on things where the elasticity of demand is so high that people will just not buy that thing. So you put a luxury tax on yachts, people just don't buy yachts, right? Whereas if you tax like the roads, everybody has to pay it, including the person who can barely pay rent. So that's my thinking there. It's not a very popular opinion in those circles, but it's a fun one to bring up at dinner.
Yeah, I don't know if we can be friends. If he's going to take up with the progressive income tax.
He's already defended Kantian ethics, and now
look at the time. We're done. Right?
No, let's
just kidding.
I said marginal, and I didn't say at astronomical rates. But yeah.
Well, let's get into the meat of it.
Yes, let's do.
Sure.
So the Acton Institute, that's where you are. It's named after Lord Acton, who was a well-known English historian, lived in the 19th century. What does naming a think tank after someone like that signify? Does Lord Acton have a specific legacy that the Institute is trying to maintain? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so Acton is, among other things, known for his many aphorisms, the most famous of which is probably his power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He's definitely a champion of limited government. So there's that side to it. But I think as far as why name our think tank after Acton, our focus is faith and economics, liberty and virtue. And for Acton, liberty and virtue were just necessarily entwined. He was Roman Catholic, and he talked about what he called the Catholic notion of liberty, which is not the freedom to do whatever you like, but the right to do what you ought. That freedom actually has a purpose. So he supported freedom, but he called it the reign of conscience. That you have to have that moral core and that moral character of a people. In that sense, I think he would agree with Edmund Burke. And I think this kind of gets back to the asceticism a little bit. Burke said, society cannot exist unless some restraint is placed on the will and appetite of its members. And the less of it there is within, the more of it there must be without. It is ordained in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their fetters. You could trace that also to the American founding fathers, very similar statements, that freedom and virtue are mutually dependent on each other, that you have to have a virtuous people in order to maintain freedom. So that, I think, is the idea. That's why we are the Acton Institute, because we want to bring together people who understand freedom and people who understand faith and virtue and get them together and show them how much they need each other, and that you can't have the one without the other.
Okay. Well, now the Acton Institute carries out its work in a variety of ways, including conferences, the Free and Virtuous Society conferences, Acton University. In addition, you also have various publications such as Religion and Liberty magazine and the Journal of Markets and Morality. So can you tell us a little bit about those efforts and what they involve?
Yeah. So the Free and Virtuous Society conferences are kind of smaller seminars. They feature a few lectures and sort of roundtable discussions. So those are maybe a little more similar if people are familiar with like Liberty Fund style Socratic discussion, although I think there's a bit more lecturing in ours. And then Acton University is really our big flagship conference. It kind of grew out of those smaller conferences years ago. We wanted to do one big one. And we do that every year at the end of June. So this year we had, I believe, over 900 participants from 70 different countries. It's 3.5 days, so 4 evening plenary lectures, and then 3 days where there are 4 sessions in morning and afternoon of various lectures from scholars, from practitioners, so that people can kind of get a sense of again that synthesis between faith and virtue, and on the one hand, and freedom, specifically economic freedom, on the other. And they also feature core lectures for any new time or any first time attendees. So everybody on the first day, first full day, has a lecture on Christian anthropology, Christian view of law, economic freedom, and I can't remember the fourth one. I think it's actually changed a few times, but basically those basic things, which are kind of the basis of my book, actually, is trying to give those intro lectures in a book. So if anyone is interested in the work we do and can't make it to the conference, you could always buy my book. As far as the publications, Religion and Liberty is kind of our quarterly magazine. It's edited by Anthony Sacramone, and it's sort of like our version of First Things. And I think he's done a great job in the last few years under his editorship, really kind of raising its profile. You can find it in newsstands now at places like Barnes and Noble, and really upgrading the quality. So we saw, especially in the last, it's been around for probably 30 years. We've been publishing it, but in the last several years, 8 years at least, magazines like First Things have really soured on economic freedom, and I would just say economic competency. And so we're kind of a place where people of faith who are interested in integrating their faith with more, mainstream economic science and, the good of economic freedom, have a place to publish and a place to read others who are interested in that. And then lastly, the Journal of Markets and Morality is the journal that I edit. It's our academic journal. It's published twice a year. It's print and online, and it's peer reviewed. So like any other peer-reviewed journal, it's kind of a long submission process, but we're looking for mostly qualitative, kind of theory-heavy contributions. We're not the sort to publish, data analysis. We think that's a good thing. It's just not what our journal focuses on. It's interdisciplinary. So trying at the highest level to integrate these sorts of ideas, a Christian perspective on lending or whatever, or an economic analysis of, church finance or something like that. Like that is the sort of thing that we're interested in publishing. And every year we do, at least in the last 3 years, we've done a theme issue based on an academic conference that I started. Our fourth one will be in October. So we have the theme of the conference, and we invite people who submitted a paper at the conference to submit to that theme issue of the journal. So our most recent one was on Thomas Aquinas in economics.
Excellent. Well, I know a lot of people listening to this conversation. I can hear some of these things going on in the back of my head, that I could anticipate people saying is that, there are a lot of people that question whether markets can really be reconciled with the Christian faith, right? The thinking is, markets are all about greed and self-interest, but Christianity is supposed to be about love and serving others and eschewing worldly possessions. So how would you respond to kind of that perception as markets as some kind of unchristian institute or activity?
I think that impression comes from probably a misreading of Adam Smith, and maybe through the grapevine. I don't know that everybody who would make that objection has even read Adam Smith. But Adam Smith was a moral philosopher in the 18th century, part of the Scottish Enlightenment. And he actually wrote 2 books, one, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and the other, his Wealth of Nations. And reading those together, I think, helps enlighten what he was talking about. So he does talk about, in general, to provide for ourselves, we don't just go around begging other people. We don't appeal to their humanity, he says. Instead, we appeal to their self-interest, not meaning that we operate only according to our self-interest, but that we actually have to have some kind of sympathy, or we would maybe even say empathy today, put ourselves in their position. So if you're a baker, you don't say, woe is me, I need to feed my family, please buy some bread. Someone comes by and you say, hey, do you smell that? Isn't that good? Wouldn't you like some tasty bread right now? Right? You appeal to them, to their self-interest. So he's really talking about the inherently social aspect of market exchanges. So I don't think that there's anything inherently greedy about it. And I think assuming self-interest and selfishness are the same is an error. And in fact, I can show you all throughout the history of economics at this point, people who are continually correcting that error. So even someone, more than 100 years later, like Alfred Marshall in his textbook, which was the standard English language textbook in economics for at least 30 years, goes out of his way to say, no, this is not about selfishness. This is just about people being unencumbered by restrictions, people being allowed to pursue their own ends rather than having other people's ends imposed upon them. That's really about just being deliberate. It's not even necessarily about being uber competitive in a negative way. And that's really all economists are talking about when they talk about liberty in markets. So I don't think there's anything fundamentally opposed to Christianity in that. I think one of the helpful things about a perspective of faith is to remind us that just because all of life has an economic aspect does not mean that everything is reducible to economics. So there's the famous story in the Gospels of Christ going to the temple and kicking out all the money changers. Some people see that, and I think unaware of the context or maybe unaware of the rest of the Bible, say, well, clearly Jesus didn't like commerce. But that's really not the point of the story. The money changers were there because in order to make your offerings at the temple, you had to use the temple coin, which is different than the Roman coin. So you actually had to change coins. So they're actually providing an important service for people. The problem is where they were providing that service. It was in the outer court of the temple, which was the only place that women and Gentiles could go to worship. So they had cluttered it up with animals and with commerce, and they were using that area to conduct their business. And what does Christ say? He fashions a whip and he drives them out, and he says, it is written, my house will be a house of worship for all nations, right? He's concerned about the Gentiles having a place to worship. So the point isn't commerce bad, right? The point is that everyone needs to be welcome in God's house, and that there's a time and place for things. I'm sure had the money changers been outside of the temple, it would have been fine, right? So there's problems like that where people just have these really facile readings of whether it's Adam Smith or the Gospels, and they kind of jump to conclusions that aren't really warranted by the context.
Yeah, on that note, I mean, you mentioned liberty. Isn't that like another sort of perception, stereotype people might have? Do you really think that there's some connection between Christianity and liberty? Well, surely not. Christianity is about keeping a lot of rules, denying yourself, minding your P's and Q's in ways that are, anti-indulgence, whatever. I take it you don't see it that way. There really is a connection between Christianity and what we think of as political liberty.
Yes, I definitely think there is. Now, to be clear, there's definitely a history of illiberalism within Christianity. I'm not trying to say that it's just unmixed or anything like that. But I think people overemphasize, the extreme examples of that, and they miss all of the important forerunners in the tradition, church history and Christian theology that are really important for liberty. So from the very beginning, you have right after the New Testament, you have this period of persecution of Christians in ancient Rome. And so you have these writers known as the apologists. They're not kind of like modern day apologists, which are kind of like the Christian version of edgelords at their worst. But they're writing letters to the emperor, trying to make a defense, an apology for Christians, saying, please stop killing us just for being Christians. And in the process, what they argue for is universal religious liberty, again and again, very consistently, to the point where Tertullian, for example, says things like, God has created us free and rational, and no person's religion harms anyone else. He basically, it's something like 1,500 years later, you find the exact same reasoning in Thomas Jefferson. When Constantine became a Christian, you have a Christian emperor. He actually didn't establish Christianity. That didn't happen until the end of the 4th century, but he did declare universal religious liberty in the Edict of Milan. And if you look at that edict, you find another aspect of liberty, which is really important. There was an earlier edict 2 years earlier that nobody remembers or cares about, but it's referenced in that one. And the difference is that the Edict of Milan returned confiscated property back to the church. It acknowledged the property rights of the church. It acknowledged that you can't have freedom without property rights. It's right there in this very important historical document in the history of Christianity. He ended the cult of, well, he didn't end, but he downgraded the cult of the emperor. So instead of worshiping the emperor as a god, he made it a fan club, basically. And he acknowledged that there was a separate authority in his own kingdom, the authority of the church. It's pretty minor in terms of what we enjoy today, but it was mind-blowing at the time, if you really think about it. And there was all kinds of problems with the church and state still being way too close in those ages. But one of the major checks on tyranny was the church. And that's because it had this separate sphere that it was understood to be sovereign over. So there's all sorts of things. I mean, I could go on and on about this sort of thing. But I look at it as, the modern liberties that we enjoy and are rightly grateful for are, the flowering of seeds planted years and years and years ago, based on things like universal human dignity and all people being created in the image of God. So that's where I see those as not just compatible, but related.
Focusing on the journal Markets and Morality for a bit, what is the gap in other research publications that journal is specifically trying to fill? In general, what kind of papers are you looking for? And can you give us an example of maybe a couple of articles that have been published recently that maybe stood out to you?
So, I mentioned our most recent issue was on Thomism in economics. We had a really great article by Paul Raddick on the virtues of the entrepreneur. So it's an analysis of the 4 cardinal virtues and 3 theological virtues as applied to the actual economic science and entrepreneurship, and the sort of character kind of business management work as well of what makes for an effective entrepreneur. And that's the sort of thing that we are looking for, trying to bring theology, philosophy, ethics in dialogue with economics, political science, and philosophy. And there's not actually a lot of journals that have that interdisciplinary angle. There's about 2 others that I can think of. One is Faith in Economics, which is published by the Association of Christian Economists. And the other is a new journal as of, I think, 2020, the Journal of Theology, Economics, and Religion. That's published, I believe, in the Netherlands, but it's European. So there's, for people interested in doing this work, there's not a lot of journals that specifically focus on it. Doesn't mean you couldn't maybe get your article published in something like the Journal of Interdisciplinary Studies, or there's a few other ones that might be interested. But as far as that specific focus, we're really one of the few. So yeah, we look for anything that fits that, and again, much more qualitative than quantitative research. So we're trying to advance the frameworks by which we think through these problems, and to really hone the arguments for and against various positions, that sort of thing.
Shifting gears a bit, in addition to being the executive editor of the Journal of Markets and Morality, you've also written quite a bit yourself. One of the topics you've written on that caught our interest was the interesting history of monasteries. And a lot of people probably don't have stereotypes of monks as, guys who don't eat a whole lot and rarely sleep because they're praying all the time and are desperately poor as a sign of their piety. You found that the history of monasteries doesn't quite reflect that in many ways, perhaps especially when it comes to wealth or money. So can you tell us a little bit about your history of the monasteries?
Yeah, so a lot of people just have that assumption that a vow of poverty means literal poverty, whereas there's been some great scholarship, especially on Western monasticism. My work has been to augment that by looking at Eastern monasticism, but to show that, well, first of all, of course, monasteries own property. In fact, they had significant land holdings. They were productive as well. So they were really engines of enterprise all throughout the ancient and medieval eras. And I mean, this starts at the very beginning. You have monks in ancient Egypt shipping goods up and down the Nile. So this has always been a part of monastic spirituality. And there's a few different influences that relate to that. One is their appropriation of Stoic ethics. So the Stoics had 3 categories of value. That is, things can either be good, of which they said virtue is the only good. Things can be evil, of which they said vice is the only evil. Christians, of course, would say sin, for example. And then everything else is indifferent. And it's only good or evil to the extent that it's used for virtue or vice. And among those things, they would include wealth. And in fact, ancient monks like St. John Cassian say exactly that. St. Basil the Great says exactly that. And I can go on and on. There's all sorts of church fathers and monks who say the exact same thing over and over again. So I look at it as this actually follows just fine from their understanding of Christian ethics and spirituality. And then the other piece is that they believe that labor was a spiritual good. So you have the Benedictine motto, ora et labora, is pray and work. In fact, one of the vices that they sought to combat was called acedia. It's sometimes translated as sloth, but it's sort of like a spiritual boredom. And the number one recommendation they had for people is, if that's what you're struggling with, you should get to work and do some manual labor, work with your hands, do something productive. And this kind of spiritual boredom or malaise will dissipate. So what do you know? Not only it is true, they did fast a lot and they did pray a lot. So they consumed very little, but they produced quite a bit. And to the point where it actually became a problem. People talk about the embarrassment of riches of some monasteries, that they had so much land and so much wealth that Well, there's a story, there's a joke, I suppose it might be appropriate for this podcast, given the title. And it's a young man visits, I believe it's like a Jesuit monastery, but I'm sure you could swap out whatever order you want to make fun of. He visits, he says, I'm thinking about a religious life, and the abbot there says, well, let me show you around, and he treats him to this wonderful, lavish dinner, and he shows him their beautiful library and all of this. And he says, son, what do you think? Do you think you might join the monastery? He says, Father, if this is the poverty, bring on the chastity. So, I mean, that's the nature of the problem, right? Is kind of unintentionally, they end up being these engines of wealth for the ancient medieval world. And I will add to that, at least in Byzantium, they were often founded on private estates. And so you have some founding documents of some Byzantine monasteries, even one founded by a bishop, that calls down invectives, in fact, up to the punishment of Judas upon anyone who would allow this monastery to fall into the hands of not only emperors or magistrates, but bishops or archbishops. And he just wants it to be kind of a third sphere of society that is independent of church and state in terms of its governance. And so you have that kind of recurrence of property and freedom. So that doesn't mean that the historical story of this is all good. There's all sorts of examples of monasteries kind of losing their spiritual vocation, I think, especially in times of crisis. So one example I bring up is the Solovki Monastery in Russia during the time of troubles. I think you have a situation where everyone else was so desperately poor that if you look at the monks and you say, well, they're surviving. Well, now you have all this incentive, even though they have these requirements of voluntary poverty, obedience, celibacy. If it means you're going to get to eat, you're going to want to join. And in so doing, it kind of corrupted the spirit of that monastery, which was founded by Metropolitan Philip II, who was a very holy man. In fact, was martyred by Ivan the Terrible. And so what ended up happening is they had these amazing, really, really productive salt mines, and they were scrupulous in their accounting. And so, several years on, during the time of troubles, they account all of their revenue, all of their profits, and then they account how much almsgiving they had, and it's a pittance. I mean, it's like less than $1, for the year. It's, just something really shocking. So you can see that it's not to say that there's no temptation that comes with wealth or money. In fact, the same fathers who say that it's inherently indifferent and can be used for virtue, nevertheless do warn that, you don't want to be carried away by the love of money or the love of wealth. That, greed, of course, is a vice that people need to be on guard against as well.
Well, Dylan, I heard you recently on a podcast speaking about cancel culture. And that term gets thrown around a lot in recent years. Will you just tell us what exactly you mean by cancel culture, and what do you make of it? Is it good? Is it bad? What do you think?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's kind of a few different forms of it. I think there are maybe the earliest isn't the right word. A more recent version, what people might think of would be like the Me Too movement. That's maybe the first we saw people really using social pressure to try to kind of end people's careers when they were accused of usually sexual assault. And I'm kind of on the fence about it, actually. So to the extent that it amounts to judging people before evidence has been considered, excommunicating them without any possibility of forgiveness or repentance, I think that's all very bad. On the other hand, especially specifically with like the Me Too stuff, like we have a statute of limitations on crimes of sexual assault in this country that if it's up, it doesn't matter what evidence comes out. A person will face no legal ramifications. But I don't think that it's only the state's job to regulate markets. In fact, I think a moral culture really matters. So I think it's a good thing that like Kevin Spacey, for example, can't get hired anymore after it came out pretty convincingly that he had sexually harassed or assaulted some young men. They can't, as far as I know, there's no legal case to make against him, but It's the sort of thing that I'm happy to see that there are some standards of morality, as shocking as it may be in Hollywood these days. That I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I remember when this all came up, there was a bunch of French actresses, I think it was back in like 2016, who actually wrote a letter saying that they were against the Me Too movement. And they accused it of being puritanical. And I remember thinking to myself, like, I actually think that's the one good thing about it. The Puritans were bad in terms of, their laws, but their moral culture was not so bad. In fact, Tocqueville rightly praises it. He says, they have all these ridiculous laws, but they never enforce them. They never have to enforce them because nobody would break them in the first place. And I think that is something that can be undervalued. I mentioned Adam Smith earlier. I think one of the problems we have today is people on the right. I'll start with people on the left tend to conflate propriety and virtue. So if you don't say the right thing in the right way, you are evil and reprehensible and should be excommunicated, and so on and so forth. And then people on the right say, well, that's ridiculous. And I think that is a correct assessment. But then they swing the pendulum the other way. They say, therefore, propriety doesn't matter. So we don't need to be polite. We don't need to be nice. We don't need to be sensitive or anything like that. And Adam Smith, his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, begins very peculiarly with an extended analysis of the nature of propriety, of just what does it mean to be polite and civil to another person. And he says this is actually really important for cultivating a culture that tends to teach people morality and virtue. So I look at cancel culture as, if that's all we have, that's a bad thing. If we're always jumping to that sort of excommunication and cancellation. On the other hand, there are all kinds of people who are doing just fine, who anytime anyone criticizes them says, oh, they're trying to cancel me. And, like Jordan Peterson, for example, is doing great as far as I can tell. And yet he's always talking about being canceled and cancel culture. And I'm just not very sympathetic to that. I again, like in the actual cases, I think Johnny Depp would be an example. It's complicated, but it seems to at least be not quite that he was fully guilty of exactly what he was accused of. But people really did jump to conclusions unfairly there. And that's an example of, due process is important. Probably a better thing would be for the United States to reform our laws on sexual assault and make them more like Britain, where there is no statute of limitations, right? Then you could take these sorts of things to court and settle it that way, and maybe it would calm down some of the cancel culture mentality.
I get what you're saying, though. That would definitely be an improvement on where we are, but there's this other element of we have certain sort of norms, let's say, that do very subtle work that create the conditions such that victims of assault feel like they can't say anything or do anything about it, right? And maybe the breakthroughs where people say Me Too sometimes result in no, we're pushing back on exactly the acceptance of that norm. That's not okay. That's part of what needs changed, as well as reforming the laws. You mentioned Jordan Peterson, and that's also a good example of when I hear the term cancel culture, I tend to hear a term that the right likes to throw at the left in a sort of, victim-y kind of way, like you're saying about Jordan Peterson. What's funny, though, is as soon as I hear the term, my paradigm example in my head is the early 2000s when the Dixie Chicks criticized George W. Bush. And I mean, the right lost its mind about this country band that just happened to say one off-color thing about the president. Or the more recent stuff about Colin Kaepernick, who literally just protests things not going well for people like him in the world. And you really would have gotten the impression from the folks that were offended is that he did the liturgy wrong. We have a very particular liturgy that we have in our football stadiums, and he is doing it in the very heretical way. I mean, I'm just bringing this up because there's plenty of this sort of behavior to go around from both sides, is there not?
Oh, definitely. And there's plenty of people who are either jumping to conclusions or maybe using ill-founded standards. So in the case of Colin Kaepernick, it is my understanding is that officially kneeling is a sign of respect in this country, and it can be a patriotic. Like it wasn't. Even if you want to say there is a certain liturgy here, I do think symbols matter. So maybe you could make that argument. Even so, he wasn't actually violating, the official code or anything like that. It was just more people politicizing and letting their politics carry into other things. Not to say that he wasn't making a political statement, but I don't know. It's a free country. Why can't he make a political statement? It was a harmless one. He didn't even say anything, right? So, I mean, that sort of thing doesn't, I agree is kind of out of hand. And I mean, the Dixie Chicks, I don't think they should be canceled. I do think, though, and this kind of, there's a flip side of this, which is maybe virtue signaling. I think companies and artists are sometimes too preoccupied with trying to do something more than just what they do well. I'm very sympathetic, for example, with Milton Friedman, who said, the social responsibility of business is to make a profit. And what he means by that is not greed all the time. He actually says there should be a legal and ethical framework and culture regulating what people do. But he says, a CEO, at least of a publicly traded company, has a responsibility to their shareholders. And if they want to promote social causes, they should do it out of their own private income, which if their CEO is probably pretty big in the first place, so I'm sure they could still do plenty of good. But instead of trying to hijack a company and then use it as a vehicle for making a stand on whatever issue. And I think it can go both ways, that you have artists, you have comedians, you have companies who make these statements or who virtue signal in one way or the other. And then suddenly, people don't like it. And they say, oh no, we're being canceled. But you know what? Like, that's how markets work. You have to produce something people like. And if they don't like it, they're not going to buy it. And too bad for you. That's just how it works. So I'm kind of okay with that as well. That there's a degree to which, if it's the sort of thing where you're tarring and feathering someone unfairly, I think, and it's a sort of mob mentality, it's a bad thing. But if it's just a reflection of you've badly misjudged the sense of propriety of your customer base, well, I'm sorry, but you should be allowed to fail. I mean, that's a really essential part of free markets. That's one of the best advances of our modern system, is that we have great bankruptcy laws. We make it easy to fail, which means that it's easy to take risks and to try new things. And that's how you get such a dynamic entrepreneurial economy that we absolutely need in order to grow our national wealth, and especially to increase upward mobility for the least of those among us. So that means sometimes people are going to make missteps, and people are going to react. Bud Light, for example, had a similar sort of reaction where they had a kind of transgender promoter, and everybody decided they didn't want to drink their beer anymore. And I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan. We're kind of the heart of craft brew culture in this country, I would say, and so I'm always happy to see the major labels make a misstep. But really, they didn't have to say anything, right? It's not that they made the wrong choice in terms of who they supported. They didn't have to support anybody. They could have just kept making their beer, and people who like that beer, which is fine. Like I'll drink one of those beers every now and then. You're watching a football game, whatever. Like, people are just going to keep drinking it. So it was just it's this weird sort of, like, sometimes the cancellation comes from someone actually just being foolish. And in that case, I don't think it's some kind of unfair sign of the times or zeitgeist or whatever. I think it's just like, you were kind of dumb and you shouldn't have said that or done that. And well, these are the consequences.
So, okay, Dylan, there was a paper that you wrote that I found that might have been the thing I was most eager to get into. All right.
Yeah.
Because you wrote a paper about one of my favorite comedy shows. I am a diehard comedy fan, and this is on my probably, would it be top 5 list? Definitely top 10 list of comedies. I probably have a dozen I could rattle off for you. This might be one in my top 5 though. You wrote a piece about Parks and Recreation.
Yeah.
There were a couple of themes in that paper I really enjoyed. Could you tell us how this show illustrates that sometimes too much intelligence is exactly why new firms or businesses fail? And secondly, why failure can be a good thing?
Yeah. So for the first point, so I there's actually a cool story behind this piece. So it's part of a collected volume called Show and Biz. I have it right here. And it's all sorts of commentary on shows from 2000 to 2020 and their depictions of the market, basically. And I think most people took a critical point of view, whereas I found something positive in a show that was all about government. But that's kind of how it came about. And I focused on especially the character Tom Haverford, but also when it comes to the point about intelligence, there's other characters. So Ben Wyatt, who's kind of the main love interest of Amy Poehler, he is kind of this nerd accountant. But there are several points at which either he loses his job or he just gets some kind of what he thinks is a good idea. And you see kind of the beginnings of maybe entrepreneurial insight. But he's known to be a smart guy. So anytime someone points out that, this is kind of a bad idea, or he even realizes, that, this is poorly executed, whatever, he just dumps the thing in the trash or he gives it away and he gives up on it and he just goes back to being an accountant. And so there's a sense in which like a person that was maybe less intelligent or had less of that kind of intelligence might have just gone and taken the risk anyway, and they might not have succeeded. But you take enough risks and eventually sometimes you do. So the kind of counterexample to him, or one of them, would be Tom. Tom, through the whole show, he says, he's almost like the ultimate like crony capitalist, right? He says the only reason he got into government was for the business connections, right? So it's a little suspicious from a kind of a free market point of view, but he's constantly, the name of the paper, actually, the chapter is, and I literally, so I wrote a blog post on WandaVision, and then one of the editors who I had published in our journal contacted me and said, "Hey, would you like to contribute?" Alberto Mingardi. I said, "Pick a show." I said, "Is Parks and Rec taken?" He said, "No." So I said, "Okay, how about this?" And I literally this was like the off the cuff title. And I'm like, I'll write it if he says yes. So it's Mouse Rat, Snake Juice, and the Cones of Dunshire. So Mouse Rat is a band of Andy Dwyer, who's the love interest of April Ludgate, two secondary characters in the show. And then Snake Juice is one of many Tom Haverford attempts to kind of get rich with an entrepreneurial idea. And that was a high-end liqueur, which I believe tasted terrible and got everybody really, really drunk in the episode. And
they are trash.
Yes, and it didn't go well. But to answer your second question, by the end of the show, like the very last episode, and I'd forgotten about this. So when they accepted my proposal for the chapter, I then signed up for Peacock for like a month or whatever, and I rewatched the entire show, and I took notes on every single episode that might have something worth mentioning. And the very last episode I'd forgotten, but he actually does succeed. So he had all these different ventures, some of them just blew up on the launch pad. Some of them, he wasted all of investors' capital and then he ran out and then they ended. He's one of his more successful ones was he realized because he's so tiny, he could rent out his swag clothes to like middle schoolers going to dances and stuff like that. So he has this business called Rent a Swag, and that goes well until he gets bought out by his friend's dad. But that's like not really a failure. That's sort of a success. A buyout isn't terrible. But he kind of comes to this realization and he writes this book, and this fake book is called Failing to Fail. And it's all about how he learned from every single failure, was able to kind of refine his understanding of what do people want and what does he have to offer. And that's part of the creative process. You see that in I think especially Joseph Schumpeter and his concept of creative destruction, and that you have these kind of market and an industry shifting innovations come about, and that means that you're going to have some old ones fail. So you get the automobile, and suddenly the demand for blacksmiths just plummets, right? But overall, including probably the former blacksmiths, it was an amazing, orders of magnitude increase of wealth. And it was good just beyond even the product of cars or Henry Ford. Suddenly you have like pizza delivery and trucking. And I mean, you can just go on and on and on. Every single industry all across the world was affected by this. And again, for the better. So you have to have that role, that space for failure. I mentioned bankruptcy laws, if they're written well, they allow for that. We don't have debtors prisons anymore, for example. And the opposite, of course, is protectionism. It's the idea of, we want to, and cronyism. We have this big industry and we want to favor it. So I often will contrast, because I live here in Michigan. I live in Grand Rapids, which is in West Michigan. I can't contrast the east and west side of the state. So the east side of the state, you have Detroit, you have Flint. And Detroit was Motown. It was Motor City. You have all the big automakers there, and really everyone tried to protect the American auto industry. It wasn't just one party going awry. It was the companies, it was the city, it was the state, it was the unions. Everybody said, we make cars, and that's all we're ever going to make, and we're going to keep doing it at the current rate with the current costs. With these extravagant kind of retirement packages and all this sort of thing. And they did that until they couldn't compete anymore. And they, basically lost the war, not that, commerce should be considered a war, but they couldn't compete with Japanese imports and, from some other places at this point. There's some of them are still kicking around, but it goes to show that you could actually just reinvent yourself. So Grand Rapids was once known as Furniture City, USA, and we still have Steelcase here. I actually worked at a door factory at one point in my past. One of the worst jobs I've ever had, but not more because of the way it was managed, not because of the work itself. So there's still some vestiges of that, but we have this huge medical research and manufacturing sector. We have, as I mentioned, all the microbrew, we're Beer City USA now. And we just have a more entrepreneurial attitude. And I look at, the big automakers, and on the one hand, they could just make better cars. I mean, that is a possibility, but they can also ask themselves, well, what else could we make in these factories? What else could we do with this capital? In World War II, they built bombs and airplanes in those factories, right? I'm not really saying we should be like big arms producers or anything like that, but the point being that you can actually reinvent yourself. And yeah, it is costly to do that. So it's not totally unlimited. It would be a big sacrifice and a big risk to do that. But it can be done. The last thing along those lines I would say is another example I point to is the company Nintendo. So I'm 40, and which means I was a kid in the 90s. And so like Super Nintendo was like the coolest thing. And the company Nintendo actually goes all the way back to the 19th century. A lot of Japanese companies are very old. And it has gotten where it has gotten by constantly reinventing itself. So they used to make playing cards and wooden toys. And then they eventually got into video games as first just a maker of games. And they started making their own consoles, their own systems. And they had the Nintendo, the Super Nintendo, the Game Boy, very successful. And then they kept trying new things. So I don't know if you remember, but in the 90s, they had this thing called the Virtual Boy. And it was this thing that you put on your face, and it had two screens of red light. And it was like 3D. So it was like the first kind of 3D video game system, but it was a total flop. Nobody wanted to like put a thing on their face and stare at red light for hours at a time, right? Like, there's some reasons why it didn't work. But they constantly, so now they have like all the motion controls, like with the first one was the Wii and, whatever. And the Wii U, they had like the screen on the controller. That one was kind of a flop. But then the next one was the Switch, which is great. It's basically, they've combined all of their things. You got the handheld system and you have the console system all in one. You can travel with it. It's really cool. And so there's there is a possibility for doing this. It does come at a cost. You have to have some kind of staple products to keep you going and to finance the risk. But they're really the trendsetters. If you look at what Sony and Microsoft have done, they usually just say, "Oh, what did Nintendo do that works? Can we do that too?" They're not exactly introducing new innovations in their field. So you have to have that space for failure, and you have to have people willing to experiment. And sometimes that means a different sort of intelligence at the very least, a different sort of know-how. The other example from Parks and Rec is Andy Dwyer, who is just, kind of absurdly unintelligent in some ways and kind of impulsive and ADD. But he's got a band. He's always writing songs. And eventually he ends up hosting a children's show for the local TV station because he turns out he's really fun. And his songs are, once he gets over writing only songs about sex, he writes songs that work for kids, and he develops the character of Johnny Karate, and it turns out he's very marketable. And because he has a wife who can kind of be the intelligence he doesn't have, she's able to kind of run the business side of things while he is more the creative talent. But again, he had to be able to try and fail in order for that to happen. So I think the show is actually really great at demonstrating that, even though the focus is local government, and you have, Leslie Knope, Amy Poehler always talking about the good of government. And, I don't think all government is bad. But you might think that the focus of the show is all about, government good, private enterprise bad, and that's really not the case. You wouldn't have any of these other characters, this amazing ensemble cast without some understanding of the good of the market and the good of entrepreneurship. So that's what my chapter really tries to tease out.
James, now that we've talked about Parks and Rec, that's the excellent segue to our final secret question that we ask every guest, I would say.
I think so, right? I'm going to let you set this up this time. But yeah, but just to give you a heads up, Dylan, this will determine which of us share this podcast broadly and which one just kind of hides it in the closet.
Okay.
All right.
So no pressure.
Here's what we ask all our guests at the end. Suppose that immediately after this podcast, you had one of two choices to spend your time. You could either immediately go watch an episode of Seinfeld, or you could immediately go watch an episode of 30 Rock. Which of those would you choose?
Oh, I think I'd go with Seinfeld.
Yes, again.
Like I said, I'm a 90s kid, and by the time 30 Rock was a thing, so I got married 14 years ago. My wife and I have never had cable. For a while, we didn't even have like a TV, and I just missed it. Like, I've seen clips and oh, that's funny, but I just generationally missed it. Whereas Seinfeld still holds up. Anytime I go back and watch those, I'm like, it's still funny, it's still good writing. So yeah, I think it would be Seinfeld.
All right.
Yeah, I think I'm ahead by 3 or 4 votes.
Yes, James, we're all aware your comedy is winning.
Well, our guest today has been Dylan Pahman, the executive editor of the Journal of Markets and Morality at the Acton Institute. He's also the author of The Foundations of a Free and Virtuous Society. Dylan, thank you so much for visiting with us today.
Yes, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, we will see you later.
Bye, folks. Thanks for listening to Curiosity Porn with the 2 best intellectual pole dancers in the United States, Dr. Guy Crane and Professor James Davenport. If you'd like to share a comment about today's episode, suggest a guest or topic, or just leave a compliment or complaint, you can reach us at curprn@gmail.com. We hope to hear from you.